presenting History's Best on PBS. The American Experience, winner of consecutive primetime Emmys. February 1972, Air Force One touches down in the People's Republic of China.
This was the week that changed the world.
I thought this was a diplomatic revolution.
But behind the pomp and pageantry, a game of cat and mouse is played.
So the Russian game made the Chinese game work. The Chinese game made the Russian game work.
Nixon's China game. Tonight on The American Experience. The American Experience is made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you. And by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to enhance public understanding of the role of technology. The foundation also supports the Sloan Technology Series, a collection of books chronicling the major technologies of the 20th century.
At the Scotts Company, we help make gardens more beautiful, lawns greener, trees taller. If there's a better business to be in, please let us know.
Liberty Mutual Insurance is a proud supporter of the American Experience. And by helping people live safer, more secure lives, we're also proud supporters of the American dream.
Hello and welcome to the American Experience. I'm David McCullough. Secret, secrecy, elaborate deception, kept in the dark, dark glasses, black raincoat, no one would know. It's interesting how often these words and expressions are repeated as the extraordinary story you're about to see unfolds. So off we went into the darkness, recalls one of the president's staff. Try to find out what was really going on, and you were in the dark, remembers a journalist. On July 15, 1971, in a television broadcast to the nation, President Richard Nixon announced that he had accepted an invitation to visit China. Talk about the element of surprise. This was almost beyond belief. Not only was America at war in Vietnam, not only was the Cold War the overshadowing reality of the time, the world divided into two exceedingly hostile camps, but it was Richard Nixon making the announcement. Nixon, of all people. Nixon, the ultimate Cold Warrior who was going to China. Furthermore, the whole thing had been arranged in secrecy. Not even the Vice President or the Secretary of State had been told what was afoot. Unpredictability is the greatest asset or weapon that a leader can have, President Nixon once observed. But the unpredictability of the trip to China was also greatly amplified by television. We all saw the toasts raised in Peking, the incongruously beaming faces of Nixon and Mao. And if the world hadn't necessarily turned upside down, we knew a very big change had taken place when at one banquet a Red Chinese orchestra broke out with Home on the Range. This is an amazing story and very important history, and particularly fascinating as it's told from within. It's an insider's account, as they remember it. Nixon's China game.
January 1969. A week into his presidency, Richard Nixon calls his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, into his office.
I sent a note to Dr. Kissinger indicating that among the many other projects we had on the table for the NSC staff to consider, that I wanted China to be given very high priority.
That's right.
I recall Henry coming down from the Oval Office. Al, this fellow wants to open relations with China. Kissinger says, I think he has lost control of his senses.
The shock inside the White House was understandable. China had been isolated since 1949, when the communist Mao Zedong took control, and the U.S. cut diplomatic ties. In the 1960s, Mao's brutal cultural revolution crushed all but his hardline supporters. They called President Nixon a gangster who wielded a blood-dripping butcher's knife. In 1969, the chances for any relationship between the United States and China seemed slim.
If they acted the way they talked during the Cultural Revolution, then it was not doable. I had no way of knowing what we were dealing with the Chinese.
Nixon had conceived an elaborate secret plan that would shock America's allies and alter the global balance of power. It was one of the most stunning surprises of the Cold War. The pivotal move in a game that changed the world.
We can see that China is the basic cause of all of our troubles in Asia. If China had not gone communist, we would not have had a war in Korea. If China were not communist, there would be no war in Indochina.
Since the 1950s, Richard Nixon had been a staunch anti-communist. But by the time he had become president in January 1969, his thinking had changed. In the increasingly dangerous atmosphere of the Cold War, Nixon wanted to bring the Soviet Union to the bargaining table. And he worried that China, the most populous nation on earth, was living in angry isolation.
The dogma, especially among right-wing Republicans like Nixon, was that communism was a monolith, that there was somebody at a control panel in Moscow who pressed buttons and communists all over the world responded to that. Now, he gets evidence that there's a growing split between the Russians and the Chinese, and he's going to use this as a lever by making a move toward the Chinese that would increase his leverage with the Russians. At the same time, he's going to maintain his relations with the Russians as a leverage against the Chinese.
In March 1969, a border dispute between China and the Soviet Union came close to sparking full-scale war. That conflict gave Nixon the opportunity to begin his China game. The president proposed to make contact through diplomatic channels in Warsaw, Poland. But the American ambassador, Walter Stessel, raised questions.
I urged Stessel to make some contacts first, but he wouldn't do it because this was so against orthodoxy and, in a sense, so dangerous. So I brought him back and took him into the president.
Ambassador Stessel, I remember, came in to say goodbye, and I said to him with Dr. Kissinger present, I said, you know, the next time you're at a social gathering in Warsaw, if the Chinese ambassador, your counterpart, is there, I would suggest you walk up and say hello to him.
Saying hello was not that simple. No one in the U.S. Embassy had any idea what the Chinese ambassador even looked like.
The danger was that Ambassador Stessel would approach the Mongolian, or even worse, the Vietnamese, and tell him that the President of the United States wanted to improve relations with his country.
A fashion show at the Yugoslavian embassy in Warsaw provided the social setting Nixon was looking for. As the show ended, American officials spotted the Chinese delegation.
I caught this Chinese on the steps of the Palace of Culture and held him and said to him, my ambassador has a message for you.
These Americans ran after us, shouting in Polish, "We are from the American embassy." The ambassador panted, "I saw President Nixon in Washington. He wants to establish relations with China."
2 initial meetings were held in Warsaw. Back in Washington, the State Department raised concerns about the damaging effect the initiative could have on America's allies. Nixon's response was to cut the State Department out. The President and his National Security Advisor would pursue China on their own.
We talked to a number of countries. In fact, we first talked to some communist countries like Romania, but the Chinese didn't trust communists. And we also talked to the Pakistanis.
Pakistan was friendly with both the U.S. and China. Its president, Yahya Khan, had dinner with President Nixon in October 1970, and with the Chinese premier, Zhou Enlai, a month later. Yahya Khan told Zhou Enlai that Pakistan was willing to be America's secret channel to China. And Khan instructed his foreign secretary to take the lead.
He said that I want to entrust to you something important and very sensitive. And from now on, only you and I will know about it in Pakistan. All messages would be handwritten to reduce the risk of leakage through secretaries. No copies would be kept.
Yahya
Khan told the premier he had a message from President Nixon. He wanted to send an American emissary to China. Nixon wanted America and China to become friends. Premier Zhou said, "I'll consider it and reply later."
Nixon was forced to wait, while Mao prepared the way for change.
During all those meetings that I personally attended, I think repeatedly Mao would say, you people should know that now our major threat is from the Soviet Union. And this is why he wanted to break this ice with the US. Because otherwise, he said that China would face enemies on both fronts.
Mao had another motivation: Taiwan. Traditionally a part of China, the island was ruled by Mao's old enemy, Chiang Kai-shek. Mao wanted Taiwan back. For 20 years, America had defended Chiang Kai-shek's island. Mao thought that a new relationship with Richard Nixon could change that. But there were risks. China's communist ally, North Vietnam, was at war with the US. Hardliners within Mao's government would view a Mao-Nixon meeting as consorting with the enemy, and they might rebel. Mao moved forward indirectly. In April 1971, he sent an invitation to the US ping pong team, then in Japan, to tour China. Mao's offer conveyed the regards of the Chinese people to the American people. The televised tour showed the new, friendly face of China to the world. In the U.S., Vice President Spiro Agnew criticized the trip, calling it a propaganda triumph for the Chinese. Agnew, who had no idea of Nixon's secret plan, was promptly told to keep quiet. After 6 months of waiting, on June 2nd, 1971, Nixon finally received a top-secret message from Beijing.
I brought it to him in the Lincoln sitting room.
Mr. President, he says, this is the most important message that a president has received since World War II and the ending of World War II. Henry read it to me with his voice trembling.
I did tell him that I thought this was a diplomatic revolution.
I went down and I found some old brandy that somebody had given me right after the inauguration. It had never been opened. Courvoisier, one of the better Courvoisiers. There are many, you know.
The message carried Chairman Mao's personal invitation to President Nixon to visit China. But first, an American envoy would be dispatched to Beijing to make the delicate arrangements.
There could be only one person to handle some of these major issues, and where secrecy was involved, I mean secret negotiations, it had to be Henry.
Kissinger embarked on an elaborate deception plan. On July 1st, he set out on a public tour of Asia. As Kissinger's entourage arrived in Pakistan, President Yahya Khan put the secret plan, codenamed Marco Polo, into action.
Yahya invited us to dinner, and in the course of the dinner, I allegedly fell ill, and he allegedly urged me to go to the mountain station he had for recuperation.
We announced that he was exhausted by this long trip and by the heat, enervating heat of the subcontinent, and needed a couple of days rest, and would be going to this beautiful hill station, 9,000 feet high, which is called Nathia Gully, about 2 hours drive from Islamabad.
A Kissinger stand-in headed for the hill station. The world's press, the U.S. Embassy staff, and all the members of Nixon's cabinet were kept in the dark. Mohammed Khan was assigned to drive the real Kissinger to a waiting plane at a military airfield. But he couldn't find his car keys.
Finally, I woke up my son, who had been using the car the evening before, and he had them under his pillow. He fished them out and said, "What's the matter? His mother not well? Are you fetching a doctor or something? What's the crisis?" So I said, he looked at his watch, said, 2:30, good Lord. So I said, "No, we are just going to Nathia Gully for rest for a few days." He woke up wide awake, and I said, "At 2:30 in the morning?" He said, "I'll never understand your generation."
We rolled up to the airplane, one engine of which was already turning over, and the other one was just waiting to be turned on. We dashed up the gangway into the forward entrance to this aircraft, and there were 4 Chinese waiting for us.
When I first saw Kissinger, I wasn't sure who it was. He was wearing a big black hat. He had dark glasses on and a big black raincoat.
We found 4 Chinese in Mao suits sitting there, whom Zhou Enlai had sent to escort me into China, but we didn't know that.
I saw a look of horror on the face of the man who was a security guard for Dr. Kissinger, because when he saw the Chinese sitting in the plane, he nearly had a fit. He thought they were being kidnapped.
So off we went into the darkness. We hadn't been gone altogether too long when Wang Hairong came to me and says, Dr. Kissinger would like to speak to you. She didn't speak English, so she said, so I popped up and went back, and there was Kissinger in splendid isolation. But he said to me, "John, do you have any shirts?"
One of the problems on these high-level trips is little things like, do you have enough shirts along? Well, anyway, I had put, I think, 2 or 3 shirts aside, put them in a separate bag, carefully preserved.
And in the morning at 4 a.m., Kissinger, like any normal human being, doesn't remember. And so he went there with no shirt except the one that was on his back.
I said, "Henry, you're going to negotiate with these tough Chinese, and before you even sit down and talk with them, you've lost your shirt."
And then Kissinger was going absolutely crazy.
The two governments had agreed that Henry Kissinger's presence be kept secret. If the mission failed to produce a diplomatic breakthrough, no one would know. But the Chinese insisted on preserving the visit on film. The National Security Advisor had only 48 hours to lay the groundwork for Nixon's visit. Soon after the Americans arrived, word came that the Chinese premier, Zhou Enlai, was on his way.
Up until then, Kissinger was quite relaxed. But then he became very nervous.
Kissinger was about to greet the prime minister of a government America did not officially recognize. In a borrowed shirt, several sizes too big.
And there's that famous photograph that was taken of him and Zhou Enlai shaking hands. And whenever one saw Henry about that, he said, "Oh, there, I'm wearing that shirt," you know. And he was very, very unhappy.
And on top of everything else, was made in Taiwan and had a label made in Taiwan. And I used to joke that when I said to the Chinese on that trip that Taiwan was close to me, I really meant it.
Just how close to Taiwan America intended to stay was the critical question. All along, Nixon and Kissinger knew the Chinese would not cooperate unless the U.S. took a step away from Taiwan. The Chinese were waiting to hear the magic words. Nixon and Kissinger were ready to say them.
I drafted this opening statement for Kissinger, which said the United States did not support two Chinas, nor one China, one Taiwan, nor an independent Taiwan. And I sat there on the edge of my chair waiting for him to repeat this little bit about Taiwan, and finally he did. At which point, Zhou Enlai said, "Good, these discussions may now proceed."
Kissinger spoke carefully from thick briefing books. His counterpart, Zhou Enlai, appeared relaxed and more spontaneous.
He spoke from only one or two little handwritten pieces of paper. It's obvious that he'd written them himself. And he referred to his notes very, very rarely.
Kissinger felt that he was being upstaged. Here he was with these several books piled in front of him, so he slammed it and shoved it aside, and that was the last we saw of the book.
Kissinger then asked the Chinese for help in ending the war in Vietnam.
Zhou Enlai's reply was about what you might have expected it to be.
No deal. U.S. troops must go.
You must just get out. Let the Vietnamese solve their own problems.
But at the same time, the very fact that he was meeting with us could be seen by the Vietnamese as an act of treachery.
The next morning, the Chinese took Kissinger sightseeing. He had just 1 day left and did not have the invitation for President Nixon in hand. The trouble was the wording.
The Chinese wanted this brief announcement, in effect, to say President Nixon was dying to go to China, and we're gracious enough to let him come visit us. The United States wanted to say China would like to have Nixon come. Nixon's delighted to accept their invitation.
The delegations worked all night to find the words. At dawn, they had them. Once the announcement is made, Zhou Enlai told Kissinger, it will shake the world, which won't be able to sleep.
The announcement I shall now read is being issued simultaneously in Peking and in the United States. Knowing of President Nixon's expressed desire to visit the People's Republic of China, Premier Zhou Enlai, on behalf of the government of the People's Republic of China, has extended an invitation to President Nixon to visit China President Nixon has accepted the invitation with pleasure.
The reaction was swift. Taiwan's ambassador James Shen accused Nixon of selling out his country.
I got a 20-minute notice last night from Mr. Rogers, the Secretary of State. He called from California.
My friend Jimmy Shen, who was the ambassador, he was really taken aback, just shattered by this.
I say we regret this, and we lodge a protest, a strong protest.
Do you expect, on the basis of your protest, are you asking if the president not go to Peking?
Well, that's the whole purpose of the protest.
Nixon tried to reassure Taiwan and quiet the critics within his own Republican Party. He persuaded conservative leader Senator Barry Goldwater to support the China trip and sent California Governor Ronald Reagan to explain the new policy to Chiang Kai-shek. Personally, I think the communist Chinese are a bunch of murdering bums, Reagan wrote in a letter to a friend. But in the big chess game going on, where Russia is still head man on the other side, we need a little elbow room. There was one reaction Henry Kissinger wanted to hear for himself. He placed a call to the Soviet ambassador.
Kissinger called me and said, "Anatoly, I've been on a trip." I knew he had been to Asia, but China? That was a surprise.
At the Central Committee, the news hit us like a bolt from the blue. My colleague said, America will be China's ally. Kissinger, what else has he agreed? When Nixon visits Beijing, anything could happen. All this will make things very difficult for us. Where will it all end?
Nixon's gamble worked. 4 days after his announcement, the Kremlin invited the president to Moscow. Long-stalled arms talks would now proceed.
As we moved closer to China, the Soviet Union didn't want to be left behind. They moved closer to us. So the Russian game made the Chinese game work. The Chinese game made the Russian game work.
But in September 1971, events in China threatened Nixon's strategy. After an alleged coup attempt, Mao's hand-picked successor, Lin Biao, was killed in a suspicious plane crash. Many high-ranking military leaders were replaced. Washington worried that the upheaval could jeopardize the president's visit. To test the waters, a full-scale dress rehearsal was mounted in January 1972. Once again, the president bypassed his State Department and chose Kissinger's deputy, General Alexander Haig, to represent him.
Much to the surprise of everyone, including myself, the president reached down and asked me to do it. I suspect he was trying to keep peace in the family, and I didn't represent a threat to anyone.
Home movies of the trip were taken by Nixon's chief of staff, Bob Haldeman, and his aide, Dwight Chapin.
It was very striking to get off the airplane and to have these great, huge poster signs saying "capitalist pigs," and so I mean, just these slogans that were putting down America or putting us down, is the way we took it. And we saw those as we drove into town.
In Shanghai, China's great trading port, the party leadership was dominated by hardliners who despised Nixon's America. Haig's host used the welcoming ceremony to attack American imperialism around the world.
When he concluded, I sat there. I was not going to return that toast because I didn't want that fellow or the Chinese government to think that that would be acceptable for an American